Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami, and together we are exposing mold. Today we are going to talk about when mold advocacy backfires. We see a lot of discussion about raising awareness and making changes politically and regulatory for helping the mold community. And while, of course, we want to see the mold community be served better and have access to honest information, there are some problems that are really overlooked in the discussion in terms of regulating the mold industry. So, the problems that we're going to discuss to just kind of bring to the surface to have a conversation about is the difficulty in setting limits, spore limits of different species of molds, and problems that could arise from that for sufferers, and actually how that could benefit the people working against you. The difficulty in fully regulating something that's not, in our opinion, fully understood, and also like the possibility of is government and medicine ever going to be fully honest about this with all of the liability, repercussion, and loss of profit that would come along with that? So those are going to be some of a few of the things that we discuss. Now, to start with setting limits, we see a lot of conversation about the need for regulating the mold industry, regulating how repairs are done, regulating possibly products used, regulating spore limits. And the spore limit and the products used actually are two things that I really want to dive into to show how any limits on these could potentially be problematic for somebody who is considered hypersensitive. So let us use the example of setting a Stachybotrys limit of 1 spore of Stachybotrys. Hypothetically speaking, if there was a regulation set that said 1 spore of Stachybotrys in a school or a renter's home or post-hurricane, that's acceptable. This is not a limit that's set. This is a hypothetical situation. For somebody who has been sensitized the way that Eric, Alicia, and I have been sensitized, one spore is too much. Not only is 1 spore too much, there's no way of telling what's actually in the house, because this actually is going to tie back to all of the failures that can be found with mold testing, with them not being able to adequately find the full concentration of all spores, all mycotoxins present. And I just want to share a personal example of a time that this could have actually killed my family if this hypothetical situation was enforced, or if there was any safe limit for Stachybotrys set. When I was a renter at my last townhouse, we went through a remediation after a long fight with our landlord. My daughter's room that was sealed off completely during remediation, not touched during remediation, had a very big dampness problem when we returned home from the remediation because we were out of the house for 6 weeks. There had been a roof leak that I believe affected that room, and things just randomly, post remediation, started growing mold in her bedroom. My landlord would not test it until after we moved, but when he did test it, there was 1 spore of Stachybotrys found, to which the testing company replied, "That is normal post remediation because you would have had things stirred up. That's fine. That's totally safe." This completely ignored the fact that that room was sealed off, all the air vents were turned off, nothing should have been getting in there. And it also completely ignored the residual problem of water damage continuing in that room and minimized it. So I just make that example to say we can't set safe limits of trichothecene producing molds. And we also can't really set a regulation in terms of which products to use. Because, Eric, we were in a private meeting last week and you were sharing with somebody how some products can actually make the results of a DNA test for specifying the species of mold null and void. Can you share a little bit about that, and also maybe speak on the one spore of Stachy or the problems with setting limits for mold?
Yeah, the PCR testing depends on using a primer to amplify the DNA. You take an existing DNA and multiply it by using this process that amplifies the test result up to something that they can detect. And it turns out that many cleaning products and even clay, which is incorporated into sheetrock, can interfere with this test, interfere with the ability of the primers to amplify the DNA up to detectable levels. So the agent is there, but the testing doesn't find it.
And what do you think of the one spore of Stachybotrys? And Alicia, when Eric's done, could you weigh in on this too? Because you had a similar situation with your rental in Arizona. That's a good story.
Well, I can explain that one spore thing. That came from Dora Dearborn and Ruth Etzel, where they noticed that the testing methods for Stachybotrys weren't finding it, and yet people had symptoms and an illness that was very consistent with trichothecene poisoning. So all this told them is that it's the testing methods that are inadequate. If you find so much as one spore, there's a very good possibility that there's whole lots of undetected trichothecenes fragments, just the dust, the toxic particles, but the entire spore that they could find was just the warning that they had that, yeah, the bad stuff is there. So if people were getting sick, like the pulmonary hemorrhage, they should go ahead and keep looking.
Yeah, my story was just that, I don't know, it was a handful of spores of Stachybotrys found on the test. Well, thankfully it was found. Usually it's not found, right? And so when people don't find it, they think they're safe. So it was found, but it wasn't enough to constitute an issue. And I don't think there is any limits to constitute Stachy as an issue, right? There's so many. I was just looking through a document today from the California Public Health Department, how they say testing for mold doesn't matter and we don't know which ones are bad. And it's like, this is ridiculous. We do know which ones are bad. So, that test really just sort of had me staying in an apartment that I couldn't. We were just paying on something and just losing money on it because it was toxic for me. Like, just even those few spores, that's not something that I can handle and manage with my health because of my sensitivities.
And who knows how much else was hiding. The other thing that I wasn't even going to bring up, but we learned from Dr. Strauss that mycotoxin test that could have a better idea or help people, homeowners, gauge a better idea of mycotoxin concentration inside their homes, that was taken off the market, never to be seen or heard of again. Nobody even knows where this test went. And what we have now is a test that can find mycotoxins in dust, but it can't find the particles that Eric's describing, the dried crystalline fragments that could be all over everything that do not have DNA, that will not be found in tests, or the full concentration could ever be known. So there's so many things that could be problematic in terms of setting a safe level without all of this being fully hashed out. And the next thing that is a concern is the idea of regulating an industry or an illness or factors surrounding an illness when it's not fully understood. Now, we talk about this all the time. Mold experts that teach, treat, educate on mold, none of them that we have ever spoken to have ever given any indication that they understand hypersensitivity the way that we do. And not many of them have even been sensitized. So they are trying to explain and justify and rationalize something they've never experienced, that they don't fully understand. They're kind of guessing at what's going on. And I know our information is theoretical, but I think that it's a really big problem when hypersensitivity is discussed in terms of post-traumatic stress or an emotional condition or in the person's head. And I'm not saying that regulating the industry would do that directly, but I think regulating the industry would do that indirectly. We can't find the mycotoxin concentration. We don't know. We're not finding everything with the current testing. Well, guess what? What you're looking for isn't here, hon. So you must just be traumatized. You must just be having like a hyper emotional response to something because this was really hard for you to endure. And not only that, but when we factor in Eric's theory of the effect, this illness looks like a charged particle induced problem that is affecting our health in a major way. This doesn't necessarily look like a toxic chemical reaction that's like a standard, classified standardly. And so, in this way, regulating this pretends like it's understood when more research is needed. And Eric, I know that this is a soapbox that you will literally die on, that people are pretending to know, treat, and understand something that has never even fully been researched, and how hard that could hurt sensitive people like us.
Yeah, this is much like a peanut allergy. People are being moved into a state of hypersensitivity where a few molecules can affect them. And when you try to compare the problems of a peanut reactor to somebody who gets a stomach ache from eating too many peanuts, it doesn't fit, it doesn't match. How could you develop a standard for how many peanut shells to have in a bar or how many jars of peanut butter to have in a store when somebody could conceivably walk in and be affected by just a few molecules? Obviously, the people that like peanuts aren't going to stand for it. And even those that are severely affected, it's probably not going to help to regulate it anyway, because so long as there's peanuts on this planet, there's still the potential of a few stray molecules drifting their way.
So is this why policy hasn't succeeded, or we don't have like a set standard because of this complexity? I think we were talking on the in the back end where this actually has been attempted, the California Ortiz bill. I would love for you to kind of go into that, Eric.
Yeah, if you read the recommendations put out by the California Department of Public Health, and if you're aware that they know all about this hypersensitivity problem, they've encountered it, you can see why they wrote their recommendations the way they did. Not to go ahead and test all the molds, not to treat all mold as toxic. It would be financially impossible. Economically, it would just completely destroy all the schools, all the buildings, because if you found any mold, you'd have to treat it all as a toxic hazard, and you can't do it. So they say, don't treat any of it that way because you just don't know. We don't know the conditions under which this acts up, this becomes super toxic, and it affects people, and it rotates into this hypersensitivity problem. It's not understood, so you can't regulate it. Doing so, it'd be virtually impossible, and trying would be economically disastrous.
That brings us full circle right to the third point that we were going to make, which is it even possible that the governmental agencies in the medical complex would ever even allow the truth to come out about this? When we look at all of the healthcare conditions that we can connect to being caused by a mold exposure or in relation to mold hypersensitivity that can actually be reversed by healing that sensitivity and eliminating the exposure, it begs the question of how many chronic illnesses are really rooted in these type of environmental causes. And to me, that begs the further question of there's no way medicine is going to lose all of their profits from the pain syndromes, the mental health syndromes, the autoimmune conditions that they're profiting on by treating, that there's a high likelihood a lot of those conditions in a lot of the population could be environmentally caused. And instead of having an honest look at an environmental cause, um, it would totally destroy. A never before seen revolution in medicine that I don't think anyone in the medical fields are really ready to roll back on their profits to allow that to happen. And we've already seen the government fail in terms of being honest about this. The EPA, they're not telling the truth about toxic mold, but they're shutting down their buildings when they can't be fixed, which I'm not exactly sure what year that happened. Eric probably is. But government oversight is already failing. The CDC is already saying toxic mold exposure is only harmful to immune compromised people without explaining that mold exposure can cause immune system failures. And so that sounds like a big problem. Another big area that they rolled back was, Eric, what you mentioned, the Ruth Etzel and Dearborn situation when they were investigating Stachybotrys and pulmonary hemorrhage. The CDC eventually rolled that back and said, oh, we thought there was a connection here, but just kidding. That was never formally ruled out with any kind of study. They just rolled it back when, did they get too many calls from insurance companies?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what Arnold Mann says in his book, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Well, it turns out that Stachybotrys is not consistently harmful in that manner, and they don't understand the conditions under which it does become harmful. So rather than deal with it, as you say, they just rolled it back. And it looks like that's happening to a lesser extent with a lot of different molds. Look at how many people are showing up with positive mycotoxin tests for all kinds of different molds in their house now, when this never used to be a problem to the extent that it drove people out of their houses. Yeah, there were people getting sick in moldy houses, but now it's off the charts to where they can no longer live in their house. They're running for their lives, living in a tent. So what changed? Well, it seems to me that if you find that all these different toxins are showing up in people's bodies, what lowered their immune surveillance to the point that these things are getting in? So when you look at if you know that the health authorities have already discussed this, encountered this problem, and they don't know what the answer is, you can see a logic in why they're saying to regard all mold as potentially toxic, but don't attach importance to any of it and don't bother testing for it because the conditions are not understood. They don't have a test that can accurately identify this process, and there's none in the foreseeable future. So they put it in a holding pattern by saying, well, just don't do much of anything until you get so sick that you require an environmental specialist, and then the burden is on you to do something about it.
Thank you, Eric. Alicia, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I just laughed at the comment by Sue.
I know, I saw you.
Girl, do not get me started. We can ignore that one. I don't want to give energy to that right now because we're talking about this, but it's just interesting because I think a lot of people, I think at the end of the day, people have good intentions with this, right? People want to progress and help people who are injured by mold, but I don't think they consider the dark side to their efforts, and that could actually be harming people who are more hypersensitive. And this hypersensitivity is not something that is just, a few people here and there. This is like a growing issue. So if you put something out for the masses, that's going to population. I mean, a lot of these people are going to be thrown in psychiatric institutes and being abandoned by their family members and friends. So this has very high consequences. So people really need to be thinking about all aspects of what they're doing in terms of building policy around this.
Yeah, setting a standard means that it's no longer vague, that you don't have an avenue to go, well, okay, you're sick, so go ahead and see an environmental specialist. Now you've got a specific cutoff. It's like our standard says that a normal person should not be affected at this level. And if you have a problem, it's your problem. It's your genetics. It's your bad diet. It's your stress. Whatever it is, it's your problem and not the building. And that's what a standard does to you.
Oh, you just made me realize this is going to be like everyone going to their doctor who's sick and told their labs are normal.
Yeah.
So I feel like this leads us to a good question that maybe we can close on. Because Alicia, you kind of made the point, the people who are advocating for policy, they're seemingly well-intentioned. They want to facilitate change. They don't want other people exposed to toxic mold, and they're just maybe some things that they're missing in consideration because they're just passionate about maybe pursuing change. Are there any aspects of regulation that either of you think should be put into effect? And, one thing that happened to me in my first rental was I had slimy mold all over the under the baseboards of our sink and under our linoleum floor on the subfloor. And our management team just came in and sprayed massive amounts of fungicide on top of it. Not trying to stop the leak, not concerned that we had small young children in the home with all of this fungicide being sprayed, not concerned with anything else. Like, that was their treatment. And so that experience was so awful for someone who maybe wasn't dedicated to learning everything they could about mold. Maybe that family would have thought that that was okay, and who knows what would have gone on with their health afterwards. And so I'm just wondering, is there anything in this giant problem that we are trying to unravel that can be safely regulated or not?
Well, they've already adopted a default policy on this, which is when the rate of sickness in a building approaches roughly 20%, that's when the regulations kick in and they go, this is obviously a sick building. But because they don't understand the conditions under which hypersensitization and illness occurs, that below 20%, they kind of leave it up to the building owners to go, well, if you want to deal with this, it's on you, because you're going to have to undertake the investigation to unveil this. So probably having a percentage of people in a building getting sick is a workable option. At least something, a certain level of people in a building that triggers an official investigation. But until we develop more sophisticated testing and understand the conditions under which chronic illness develops, they really can't write any legislation because it wouldn't be binding and it wouldn't mean anything.
I think that was great. That was great. I mean, I don't have anything else to add to that, I think.
As you say, some people are very sincere and they want to do what they can, and it seems logical. Let's ask for a law. Let's ask for a standard on this, and they haven't really thought this through. And I believe, as you say, that they are well-intentioned in attempting this. They just don't really understand the issues. But there are some people who are not really well-intentioned. And how do we unveil people who are not? Well, when their automatic knee-jerk reply is mold is everywhere, all mold is toxic, then you can see they have a vested interest in keeping this vague with no further research. If they really wanted to solve it, they go, yeah, we need to look at which molds are toxic, why they're acting up. We need to look into this and look hard. So that's really a dividing line between those who want to make progress, want science, have good intentions, and those who like things just the way they are and profit in a climate of vagueness and uncertainty.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Eric. Before we wrap up here, do either of you have any final thoughts on this topic?
No, I'm good.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on today's Wellness Wednesday. As always, if you have topics that you'd like to see us dive into, please email us or send us a message. Thank you for joining, and we will see you next week.